Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In March of 1897, the Boston Daily Globe printed a small notice on page 6 regarding personnel changes at St. Ambrose Parish in the North End. The article, barely 4 sentences long, reported that Father Cornelius Blackwood had been removed from his duties pending investigation into what the Archdiocese termed administrative irregularities. No further details were provided, and the notice attracted little attention among readers more concerned with political scandals and harbor commerce. The article failed to mention that this brief announcement would mark the beginning of one of the most disturbing ecclesiastical scandals in Massachusetts history, one that church authorities would labor to suppress for over a century. St. Ambrose Parish stood on a narrow street in Boston's North End, a neighborhood of crowded tenements housing thousands of Irish Catholic immigrants who had fled famine and poverty for the promises of America. The parish had served this community since 1871, providing not only spiritual guidance, but practical assistance to families struggling to establish themselves in a city that often regarded them with suspicion and contempt. For these immigrants, the parish priest was a figure of absolute trust, a shepherd who guided them through the difficulties of birth, marriage, illness, and death. Father Blackwood had served St. Ambrose for 7 years, and parishioners regarded him as devoted to his flock, particularly attentive to the sick and dying, and generous with burial services for those who could not afford proper funerals. None could have imagined what investigators would eventually discover in the crypt beneath the church. What lay hidden in those underground vaults would challenge the faith of an entire community, destroy reputations, and reveal horrors so profound that powerful men would conspire to bury the truth alongside the victims. This is the story of Father Cornelius Blackwood and the terrible secrets that festered beneath St. Ambrose Parish. St. Ambrose Parish was constructed in 1871 to serve the growing Irish Catholic population of Boston's North End, a community of immigrants who had arrived in successive waves following the Great Famine and continued to pour into the city seeking work and opportunity. The church itself was a modest brick structure, unremarkable in its architecture, with a small rectory attached where the parish priest resided. What distinguished St. Ambrose from other parishes of similar size was its extensive crypt system, which extended beneath the church and into the adjacent lot. This underground burial vault had been expanded from an older structure predating the church's construction, originally serving a Protestant congregation that had relocated westward as the neighborhood's demographics shifted. The crypt's unusual size made it one of the few affordable burial options for impoverished immigrant families who could not afford plots in the city's proper cemeteries. The north end of the 1,890 was a place of desperate poverty and remarkable resilience. Families crowded into tenement buildings where multiple generations shared single rooms, where disease spread rapidly through inadequate sanitation, and where death was a constant companion. Mortality rates among children were staggering, with scarlet fever, diphtheria, and typhoid claiming young lives with terrible regularity. In this environment, the parish priest occupied a position of extraordinary importance, serving not merely as spiritual guide, but as counselor, advocate, and witness to the most intimate moments of family life. Father Thomas Brennan had served St. Ambrose from its founding until his death in 1889, earning deep respect for his tireless ministry to the poor. His meticulous parish records, documenting every baptism, marriage, and burial, would later prove invaluable to investigators attempting to establish the scope of his successor's crimes. When Father Cornelius Blackwood arrived in January 1890, he came with impeccable credentials from a prominent Boston family and an education that could have secured him assignment to any parish in the Archdiocese. Yet he had specifically requested St. Ambrose, a poor parish with an unusually large crypt, and church authorities saw no reason to question why such a man would choose to minister among the city's most destitute immigrants. Cornelius Blackwood was born in 1851 to one of Boston's most prominent Brahmin families, raised in a stately Beacon Hill townhouse among the Protestant elite who controlled the city's commerce and politics. His father was a successful merchant with connections to banking interests throughout New England, and young Cornelius was educated at the finest institutions, destined for Harvard and a career befitting his social station. This background made his conversion to Catholicism at age 19 all the more shocking to those who knew him. In an era when Boston's Catholics were overwhelmingly working-class Irish immigrants viewed with suspicion and contempt by the established Protestant families, Cornelius Blackwood's embrace of Rome scandalized his relatives and severed most of his family connections. He entered St. John's Seminary in Brighton shortly after his conversion, and records from that institution paint a portrait of a brilliant but deeply isolated young man. Professors noted his exceptional intellect and his facility with Latin and theology, but also remarked upon his solitary nature and his unusual preoccupations. Blackwood displayed an intense interest in what seminary documents term mortuary theology, the spiritual significance of death and the fate of the physical body awaiting resurrection. He wrote papers on the sanctity of mortal remains and argued passionately for the sacred duty owed to the deceased. Testimonies from seminary classmates, collected during the 1897 investigation, recall Blackwood's habit of spending hours alone in the seminary's small chapel, often remaining there through the night in apparent prayer. He displayed particular devotion to the Feast of All Souls, the November commemoration of the faithful departed, and was known to visit cemeteries for private meditation. Most telling was a note in his academic file from a professor who observed that Blackwood had requested special permission to assist at funerals conducted by seminary faculty. The professor wrote that Blackwood displayed what he termed an excessive attention to the preparation of the deceased, lingering over the bodies longer than necessary, and asking detailed questions about the physical processes of death and decomposition. At the time, these interests were attributed to unusual piety rather than pathology. Father Blackwood was ordained in 1878 and received his first assignment at St. Michael's Parish in Worcester, where he would serve for 11 years without any formal complaints or recorded incidents. To his parishioners he appeared a devoted priest, particularly attentive to those who were ill or dying, always willing to sit vigil at deathbeds and offer comfort to grieving families. He developed a reputation for his ministry to the deceased, insisting on personally overseeing funeral preparations and conducting burial services with what parishioners interpreted as profound reverence. It was only during the 1897 investigation that troubling patterns from this period came to light. Agnes Mulcahy, who served as housekeeper at St. Michael's Rectory throughout Blackwood's tenure, provided testimony that cast his Worcester years in a disturbing new light. She recalled that Father Blackwood insisted on personally preparing bodies for viewing in the church basement, a task typically left to undertakers or family members. He would spend unusual amounts of time alone with the deceased, sometimes remaining in the basement for hours with the door locked. When she expressed concern, he explained that he was praying for the souls of the departed and ensuring they were treated with proper dignity. Mulcahy testified that she felt unease but dismissed it, unable to reconcile her suspicions with her faith in the priesthood. She attributed his behavior to sincere, if excessive, piety and spoke of it to no one. Correspondence preserved in archdiocesan archives reveals that in 1889, Father Blackwood specifically requested transfer to a parish with extensive burial facilities. His letters to church authorities articulate his sense of particular calling to minister to the dead, arguing in theological terms for the sacred duty owed to mortal remains awaiting resurrection. He wrote that he wished to devote himself fully to this ministry in a parish where such services were most needed. When the position at St. Ambrose became available following Father Brennan's death, Blackwood's request was granted without question. The parish's large crypt and the high mortality rate among its impoverished parishioners made it ideal for his purposes, though church authorities could not have understood what those purposes truly were. Father Blackwood arrived at St. Ambrose Parish in January 1890 during one of the coldest winters Boston had experienced in years. He moved into the small rectory adjacent to the church and immediately began making changes to parish operations that, in retrospect, served to facilitate his crimes while appearing to demonstrate admirable dedication to his new flock. His first significant action was to dismiss Michael Flanagan, the elderly sexton who had maintained the church and crypt for over 2 decades under Father Brennan. Flanagan had intimate knowledge of every vault and passageway beneath St. Ambrose, and his removal eliminated a potential witness to irregularities. In his place, Blackwood hired Patrick Doyle, a young immigrant recently arrived from County Cork, who spoke limited English and desperately needed employment. Doyle was grateful for the position and asked few questions about his new employer's unusual requirements. Father Blackwood then assumed personal responsibility for all duties related to the preparation of the dead, tasks that were typically delegated to professional undertakers or handled by family members according to their customs. He explained to parishioners that he wished to ensure every departed soul received proper spiritual attention before burial, and his offer to perform these services himself was received as an act of exceptional pastoral care. Parish financial records show that he significantly reduced fees for burial services in the crypt, making St. Ambrose the most affordable option for the neighborhood's poorest families, those who could not afford plots in proper cemeteries or the services of established undertakers. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within his first year, burials at St. Ambrose increased substantially as impoverished families took advantage of the reduced costs. Father Blackwood now had a steady supply of bodies passing through his care and complete control over their handling and interment. Neighbors in the adjacent tenements noted that lights were visible in the church basement late into the night, sometimes burning until dawn. When asked about these unusual hours, Father Blackwood explained that he maintained vigils of prayer for the recently departed, ensuring their souls were properly commended to God before their final rest. The testimonies collected during the 1897 investigation reveal the profound trust that parishioners of St. Ambrose placed in Father Blackwood, a trust he cultivated deliberately and exploited without mercy. Immigrant families praised his compassion and his willingness to serve those whom others might have overlooked. He performed burial services for families who could not afford even the modest fees charged by other parishes, sometimes waiving costs entirely for the most destitute. He learned the names and histories of his parishioners with remarkable attention, remembering details of their lives and losses that made each family feel personally known to their priest. What parishioners noted most frequently was Father Blackwood's particular tenderness toward deceased children and young women. In a neighborhood where childhood mortality was devastatingly common, his attention to these losses seemed a profound gift. Margaret O'Brien lost 2 daughters to scarlet fever in the winter of 1893, and her testimony from 1897 remains among the most heartbreaking documents in the case file. She recalled that Father Blackwood came to her tenement the evening her girls died and offered to sit with their bodies through the night, telling her that he would ensure their souls were properly commended to God and that she should rest while he kept watch. She remembered weeping with gratitude at his kindness, never imagining what occurred during those dark hours while she slept in the next room. Other parishioners recalled Father Blackwood's seemingly genuine grief at funerals, the tears that appeared in his eyes as he spoke of the departed, and his detailed eulogies that demonstrated intimate knowledge of each person's life. He promised families that their loved ones would rest peacefully in the crypt beneath St. Ambrose, that he would personally ensure they were undisturbed in their eternal sleep. None of the immigrant families questioned why a priest from a wealthy Beacon Hill background had chosen to serve in one of Boston's poorest parishes. They attributed his presence among them to extraordinary piety and considered themselves blessed to have such a devoted shepherd. They could not have been more tragically wrong. Patrick Doyle was 23 years old when Father Blackwood hired him as sexton of St. Ambrose in February 1890. He had arrived in Boston only months earlier from County Cork, speaking limited English and desperate for any employment that would allow him to send money home to his family. The position at St. Ambrose seemed a blessing, offering steady wages and respectable work, maintaining the church and its grounds. Doyle could not have known that he was being selected precisely because his circumstances made him unlikely to ask questions or challenge his employer's authority. During the 1897 investigation, Doyle provided testimony that proved crucial to understanding the scope of Father Blackwood's activities. He revealed that the priest maintained strict control over the crypt, keeping certain sections permanently locked and forbidding Doyle from entering those areas without explicit permission. When Doyle asked about these restrictions, Father Blackwood explained that the older vaults contained remains in fragile condition and required careful handling that only he was qualified to provide. On several occasions, Doyle heard sounds emanating from the locked sections late at night when he returned to the church to complete tasks. He described hearing movement, footsteps, and what sounded like something heavy being dragged across stone floors. When he mentioned these sounds to Father Blackwood, the priest offered explanations that seemed reasonable at the time: structural inspections of aging vaults, reorganization of older remains to make room for new burials, or simply his own movements during private prayer vigils. Doyle noticed that certain burial vaults were opened and resealed multiple times, the mortar around their edges showing signs of repeated disturbance. He also observed that Father Blackwood maintained a private journal that he kept locked in his study and wrote in frequently, often late at night after returning from the crypt. The sexton testified that he grew frightened over time, but felt trapped by his circumstances. He feared losing his position and doubted that anyone would believe accusations against a priest from a young immigrant who barely spoke the language. Most disturbing was his recollection that Father Blackwood was particularly attentive to the bodies of young women and children, sometimes requesting to be left alone with them for hours before burial. William Garrett had operated his undertaking establishment on Hanover Street for 15 years, serving the North End's immigrant families with professional dignity and reasonable fees. He occasionally worked with St. Ambrose Parish when families could afford his services rather than relying solely on Father Blackwood's offer to prepare their loved ones without charge. Garrett took pride in his work, ensuring that the deceased were presented with care and respect for their final viewing. It was this professional attention to detail that led him to notice inconsistencies in Father Blackwood's handling of remains, inconsistencies that troubled him deeply, even as he struggled to understand their significance. Garrett first noticed something amiss in 1893 when he prepared the body of a young woman for viewing at St. Ambrose. When he returned the following day for the funeral, he observed that her clothing had been refastened incorrectly, buttons misaligned in a way he would never have permitted. Her hair, which he had arranged carefully, had been disturbed and rearranged in a different style. The cosmetics he had applied to give her a peaceful appearance had been altered. He assumed at first that family members had visited and adjusted their loved one's appearance, though this seemed unusual. Similar incidents occurred over the following 2 years, always with bodies that had been left in Father Blackwood's care overnight before burial. In 1895, Garrett encountered evidence he could not easily dismiss. He had prepared and sealed a coffin containing the body of a 17-year-old girl who had died of consumption, using wax seals that would reveal any tampering. When he arrived at St. Ambrose for the burial service, he discovered that the seals had been broken and reapplied poorly, the wax showing clear signs of disturbance. When he confronted Father Blackwood, the priest explained calmly that the family had requested he recover a rosary they wished to keep as a memento. Garrett accepted this explanation, but began documenting every inconsistency in a private ledger, recording dates, names, and observations. His testimony would prove crucial to the investigation, but in 1895 he had no framework for understanding what the evidence might indicate. His ledger entry from that year reads, "Something is not right at St. Ambrose, but I cannot name what manner of wrongness it is." The investigation that would ultimately expose Father Blackwood's crimes began with a letter received by the Archdiocese of Boston in February 1897. The letter came from Sister Catherine Dowd, a nun who had served as parish nurse at St. Ambrose from 1894 until requesting transfer to a convent in western Massachusetts in late 1896. Sister Catherine's letter, preserved in archdiocesan archives and not unsealed until 1987, detailed her growing alarm over Father Blackwood's behavior during her 2 years at the parish. She wrote that she had initially admired Father Blackwood's dedication to his ministry, particularly his attention to the dying and deceased. However, over time she witnessed incidents that filled her with profound unease. She described finding him in the crypt at unusual hours, sometimes in states of what she termed spiritual transport. His face flushed, his breathing rapid, his manner agitated when she interrupted him. He refused to allow her to assist with the preparation of female bodies, a task she had performed at previous assignments, insisting that he alone would attend to these duties. Sister Catherine documented an incident in December 1896 that finally compelled her to act. She had entered the crypt to retrieve medical supplies stored there and discovered Father Blackwood in one of the locked vault areas he normally kept restricted. He was startled by her presence and quickly concealed something beneath his cassock before ordering her to leave. His face, she wrote, bore an expression she had never seen on a priest, one that haunted her dreams afterward. Most disturbing was her discovery, made while cleaning a storage area near Father Blackwood's private chapel, of items that should not have been there. Women's undergarments, hair ribbons, a child's dress, and other personal effects she recognized as belonging to deceased parishioners she had helped nurse in their final illnesses. Unable to reconcile what she had witnessed with her faith in the sanctity of the priesthood, Sister Catherine requested transfer without stating her reasons. It was only after months of prayer and spiritual anguish that she wrote to the archdiocese, stating her belief that Father Blackwood was committing acts of desecration against the dead and begging church authorities to investigate. The Archdiocese of Boston received Sister Catherine's letter on the 8th of February, 1897, and its initial response reflected the institutional tendency to protect clergy from scandal that would characterize church handling of such matters for generations to come. Bishop John Williams, who had led the Archdiocese since 1866, assigned the matter to Monsignor Francis Hurley, a trusted administrator known for his discretion and his ability to resolve sensitive situations without public embarrassment, to the church. The bishop's instructions were explicit. Monsignor Hurley was to conduct a private inquiry with utmost discretion, and under no circumstances was the matter to become known outside archdiocesan offices. Monsignor Hurley's initial approach was to find an innocent explanation for Sister Catherine's accusations, and his first interview with Father Blackwood in mid-February seemed to accomplish this goal. Father Blackwood responded to the allegations with calm composure, expressing sorrow that Sister Catherine had misunderstood his devotional practices. He explained that his nocturnal hours in the crypt were prayer vigils for the departed, that his agitation when interrupted was merely the disorientation of being roused from deep meditation, and that the items Sister Catherine discovered were donations for the poor that he stored temporarily before distribution. His manner was so assured, his explanation so reasonable, that Monsignor Hurley was initially inclined to close the inquiry and reassure the bishop that no impropriety had occurred. However, Monsignor Hurley was a thorough man, and he took the additional step of quietly interviewing others connected to St. Ambrose Parish. He spoke with Patrick Doyle, whose account of locked vault sections, nocturnal sounds, and repeatedly disturbed burial chambers troubled him considerably. He interviewed William Garrett, whose professional observations of tampered bodies and broken coffin seals could not be easily dismissed. These testimonies corroborated enough of Sister Catherine's account that Monsignor Hurley could not in conscience close the matter. His internal report to Bishop Williams, dated the 27th of February, 1897, noted that while he found no definitive evidence of wrongdoing, the pattern of behavior described by multiple witnesses was concerning enough that he recommended a physical inspection of the crypt beneath St. Ambrose to determine whether any irregularities existed. The inspection of St. Ambrose Parish crypt took place on the 3rd of March, 1897, conducted without advance warning to Father Blackwood. Monsignor Hurley arrived at the church, accompanied by Dr. Samuel Whitmore, a physician who had performed work for the Archdiocese previously, and Sergeant Thomas Flynn of the Boston Police Department, whose presence the bishop had reluctantly authorized should the situation require civil authority. Father Blackwood was in the rectory when they arrived, and appeared startled by the unannounced visit, though he quickly composed himself and offered to assist with whatever the Monsignor required. When informed that they intended to inspect the crypt, his composure faltered momentarily before he agreed to guide them through the burial vaults. The initial inspection of accessible areas revealed nothing overtly concerning. The crypt was orderly, the burial vaults properly sealed, the atmosphere one of appropriate solemnity for a repository of the dead. However, when Monsignor Hurley demanded access to the locked sections that Patrick Doyle had described, Father Blackwood's demeanor changed dramatically. He became agitated, insisting that those areas contained older remains in fragile condition and that entry would constitute desecration of sacred spaces. He cited his authority as parish priest and invoked the sanctity of the dead, but Monsignor Hurley was unmoved. When Father Blackwood refused to produce keys, Sergeant Flynn forced the locks. What investigators discovered in the restricted section disturbed them profoundly. Father Blackwood had constructed a small private chapel in one of the older vault chambers, furnished with an altar, candles, and religious icons. Interspersed with these devotional items were personal effects clearly taken from the deceased: jewelry, locks of hair bound with ribbon, photographs, and items of clothing arranged in what Dr. Whitmore described in his report as a shrine-like manner. A woman's nightgown was draped over a chair, a child's shoes placed before the altar as if in offering. More disturbing still were the physician's observations of several coffins in the adjacent vaults, coffins that showed unmistakable signs of having been opened repeatedly. The seals were compromised, the wood worn smooth around the edges from repeated handling, the lids fitting poorly from being removed and replaced numerous times. Dr. Samuel Whitmore conducted his examination of the disturbed remains over several days in March 1897, working in the crypt beneath Street Ambrose with only a police officer present as witness. His clinical report, written in the formal medical terminology of the era, would be suppressed by the Archdiocese immediately upon completion and not unsealed until 1987, 90 years after the horrors it documented. The report reveals the methodical work of a physician struggling to maintain professional detachment while confronting evidence of profound depravity. Dr. Whitmore examined the contents of 14 coffins that showed signs of repeated opening, documenting his findings with clinical precision. The remains were primarily those of young women and female children ranging in age from 6 to 24 years at the time of death. His observations noted that the positioning of remains was inconsistent with natural decomposition and settling, indicating that bodies had been moved, manipulated, and repositioned after burial. Clothing had been disturbed and refastened incorrectly, sometimes inside out or with buttons misaligned. Hair had been unbound and rearranged. In several cases, bodies showed clear evidence of having been removed entirely from their coffins and later returned, based on the displacement of the fabric linings and the position of the remains relative to the coffin walls. Most disturbing were Dr. Whitmore's observations of physical indicators consistent with violation of an intimate nature. His report employs the cautious language typical of medical documents from that period, but his meaning is unmistakable to those who understand the terminology. He noted evidence of interference with the remains that could only have occurred through deliberate physical manipulation, and his examination of the bodily positioning and condition led him to conclude that violations had occurred on multiple occasions over extended periods following interment. Some remains showed evidence of disturbance spanning months or even years. Dr. Whitmore's conclusion, stated with professional restraint that barely conceals his revulsion, was that the remains showed clear evidence of repeated interference of an intimate nature, suggesting a sustained pattern of violation rather than isolated incidents perpetrated by someone with regular access to the crypt and the privacy to conduct such acts undisturbed. Father Cornelius Blackwood was arrested on the 7th of March, 1897, 4 days after the inspection of the St. Ambrose crypt. The arrest was conducted quietly in the early morning hours to avoid public attention, with Sergeant Flynn and 2 officers arriving at the rectory before dawn. Father Blackwood offered no resistance, dressing calmly and accompanying the officers to Boston Police Headquarters without protest. He was placed in a private holding room away from other prisoners, and Detective Michael Brennan was assigned to conduct the interrogation, given the sensitive nature of the case and the need for absolute discretion. Detective Brennan's report provides a detailed account of the 12-hour interrogation that followed. Initially, Father Blackwood maintained his innocence with remarkable composure. He claimed that the evidence discovered in the crypt had been misinterpreted, that his collection of personal effects from the deceased was devotional in nature, meant to aid his prayers for their souls. He defended his behavior in theological terms, citing obscure church traditions regarding relics and the veneration of mortal remains. His manner was articulate and assured, and Brennan noted that the priest spoke as if he were delivering a lecture to a student rather than defending himself against criminal accusations. However, when Detective Brennan confronted Blackwood with the specific clinical findings from Dr. Whitmore's examination, the priest's demeanor shifted. The detective presented the medical evidence methodically, describing in detail what the physician had discovered in each violated coffin. Over the following hours, Blackwood's composure gradually eroded, and he began to confess. At first, he minimized his actions, admitting only to disturbing the remains but denying violation. Then, piece by piece, he revealed the full extent of what he had done. Brennan's report describes the confession as delivered in a tone of eerie calm, as if Blackwood were describing the actions of another person entirely. The priest maintained throughout that he had loved the deceased, that his actions were expressions of spiritual union with souls awaiting resurrection, and that he had kept them company in their terrible solitude beneath the cold earth where others had abandoned them. Detective Brennan's record of Father Blackwood's confession remains one of the most disturbing documents in Boston criminal archives, preserved in police files that were sealed for decades and only made available to researchers in the 1992nd. The confession extended over several hours, with Blackwood speaking in a measured, almost professorial tone as he described violations spanning nearly 2 decades of his priesthood. He admitted that his crimes had begun during his years in Worcester, though without access to that parish's crypt, investigators could not verify the extent of his activities there. He recalled specific incidents, but claimed that the full scope of his early violations was lost even to his own memory, so numerous had they become. At St. Ambrose, where he had complete control over the crypt and its contents, Blackwood confessed to targeting primarily young women and female children, whom he described as the purest vessels for the spiritual communion he sought. He maintained private records of each victim in the journal Patrick Doyle had observed him keeping, documenting their physical descriptions, the dates of each violation, and his emotional responses to these encounters. He characterized these experiences as profound spiritual unions, moments when he felt closest to God through intimate contact with those who had passed beyond the veil of death. Blackwood described elaborate rituals he had developed, combining elements of Catholic liturgy with his violations in what he termed a sacred marriage between the living and the dead. He spoke of candles, prayers, and the careful preparation of remains before each encounter. He expressed his belief that he was performing a holy duty, keeping company with souls abandoned in the cold darkness beneath the earth, awaiting resurrection in loneliness and silence. His confession revealed that he had violated over 30 sets of remains during his 7 years at St. Ambrose, returning to some repeatedly over months or years until decomposition advanced beyond his preferences. What disturbed Detective Brennan most profoundly was Blackwood's complete absence of remorse. To the end, he maintained that his actions were expressions of sacred love rather than desecration, and he seemed genuinely unable to comprehend why others viewed his ministry to the dead with horror. The Archdiocese of Boston moved with remarkable speed and efficiency to suppress all knowledge of Father Blackwood's crimes and prioritizing institutional protection over justice for the victims or transparency with the faithful. Bishop Williams met privately with city officials within days of Blackwood's confession, negotiating an arrangement that would keep the details from public knowledge. The bishop argued that revelation of such horrors would devastate the Catholic community, destroy faith among the immigrant families who depended on the church, and bring shame upon innocent priests throughout the diocese. City officials, many of whom had their own reasons for maintaining good relations with the powerful archdiocese, agreed to cooperate. Father Blackwood was never formally charged with any crime. Instead, he was quietly transferred to St. Joseph's Retreat, a private Catholic psychiatric facility in rural Connecticut that accepted troubled priests requiring discreet removal from their duties. Official archdiocesan records list his departure from St. Ambrose as medical leave for nervous exhaustion, with no indication of the true circumstances. The crypt beneath St. Ambrose was sealed permanently, its entrance bricked over. Families who inquired about visiting their loved ones' graves were told that structural concerns with the aging vaults necessitated closure, and that the remains had been blessed and would rest undisturbed. The police report on the case was classified and filed in restricted archives. Dr. Whitmore's medical findings were sealed by archdiocesan order. Sister Catherine Dowd, whose letter had initiated the investigation, was transferred to a remote convent in Nova Scotia with explicit instructions never to speak of what she had witnessed or reported. Pressure was applied to ensure the silence of other witnesses. William Garrett was visited by archdiocesan representatives who persuaded him that public knowledge would only cause additional suffering to the families of victims and that Christian charity demanded discretion. Patrick Doyle was offered money to return to Ireland and given to understand that his prospects in Boston would suffer if he spoke of his former employer. The single newspaper notice of Father Blackwood's removal from St. Ambrose generated no follow-up coverage. The story simply disappeared, buried as thoroughly as the victims in the sealed crypt. The families whose loved ones lay in the crypt beneath St. Ambrose were never officially informed of what Father Blackwood had done to their remains. The archdiocese's policy of absolute suppression extended to the victims themselves, denying families the knowledge they would have needed to seek justice, to properly mourn, or even to remove their loved ones from the defiled ground where they rested. For most, the truth remained hidden, surfacing only in fragments and rumors over subsequent decades, pieced together by descendants who sensed that something terrible had occurred but could never confirm their suspicions. The case of Margaret O'Brien illustrates the devastating impact of this enforced silence. Her two daughters, who died of scarlet fever in 1893, were among Father Blackwood's victims, their bodies violated repeatedly over 4 years, while their mother believed they rested peacefully under the priest's devoted care. In 1898, approximately 1 year after the crypt was sealed, Margaret received an anonymous letter describing what had been done to her children. The letter was likely written by Patrick Doyle, who had returned to Ireland but apparently could not bear the weight of his silence. Margaret suffered a complete mental collapse and spent the remainder of her life in an asylum, never recovering from the revelation. Her surviving children were told only that their mother's mind had broken from grief. Other families experienced the aftermath in different ways. Descendants interviewed in the 1,990 seconds reported that their requests to visit graves in the St. Ambrose crypt were repeatedly denied after 1897, with parish officials citing structural concerns that somehow never affected other church functions. Some families noted that grandmothers or great-aunts who had buried children at St. Ambrose refused ever to enter a Catholic church again after that year, maintaining this position until their deaths without explaining why. These women carried their suspicions in silence, perhaps having heard rumors or sensed the truth, but unable to speak of horrors that had no name in their vocabulary. The intergenerational trauma caused by Father Blackwood's crimes was compounded immeasurably by the suppression that followed, denying families closure, justice, or even the simple dignity of truth. Father Cornelius Blackwood spent the final 15 years of his life at St. Joseph's Retreat in rural Connecticut, a facility operated by the Church for priests requiring removal from active ministry due to scandal, mental illness, or other circumstances demanding discretion. Records from the facility, obtained by researchers in 1992 following prolonged legal efforts, reveal the comfortable conditions of his confinement and the ongoing relationship between Blackwood and archdiocesan officials who visited regularly throughout his years there. He was housed not in the main building with other patients, but in a private cottage on the facility grounds, afforded privileges that suggested his continued importance to those who had arranged his quiet disappearance. Staff notes describe Blackwood as cooperative and causing no difficulties, spending his days in prayer and theological study in his private quarters. He was permitted to say Mass daily, though always alone, never again in the presence of others. He had access to an extensive library and maintained voluminous correspondence with church officials in Boston and elsewhere. Portions of these letters survive in archdiocesan archives, and they reveal that Blackwood continued to defend his actions on theological grounds until the end of his life. He wrote of his sacred ministry to the dead, his spiritual unions with departed souls, and his incomprehension at being punished for what he maintained were acts of holy love. He expressed no remorse and sought no forgiveness, convinced to the last that history would vindicate his understanding of the duties owed to mortal remains. Father Blackwood died on the 14th of October 1912 at the age of 61. His death certificate lists the cause as heart failure. He was buried in an unmarked grave on the facility grounds, with no funeral mass and no announcement of his passing. His name was expunged from official parish records at St. Ambrose, erased as if he had never served there. The cottage where he had lived was demolished in 1955 during facility renovations, and local residents reported for years afterward that no grass would grow on the site where he was buried, the earth remaining barren and black regardless of efforts to seed it. The truth about Father Cornelius Blackwood remained buried for 90 years, sealed in archdiocesan archives and police files that gathered dust while the victims' families lived and died without answers. The emergence began in 1987, when the Archdiocese of Boston, facing legal pressure unrelated to the Blackwood case, unsealed a collection of historical documents as part of a larger records release. Among these papers, researchers discovered Sister Catherine Dowd's original letter, Monsignor Hurley's internal report, and partial records of the 1897 investigation. These fragments prompted renewed interest in the case, and historians began searching for additional documentation. In 1992, the complete police file was located in Boston City Archives, including Detective Brennan's interrogation notes and the full transcript of Father Blackwood's confession. The discovery prompted extensive analysis by modern experts attempting to understand both the crimes and their concealment. Psychologists specializing in paraphilias examined Blackwood's confession for insights into the pathology that drove his violations. Historians of clergy abuse studied the case as an early example of institutional patterns that would repeat throughout the 20th century. Theologians examined how church structures, with their emphasis on clerical authority and institutional reputation, enabled such violations and ensured their concealment. St. Ambrose Parish closed in 1968 as the North End's population shifted and the building stood empty until its conversion to condominiums in 1985. The crypt was filled with concrete during the renovation, the remains left in place beneath the new foundation. Residents of the building have reported unexplained phenomena in the basement areas over the years, including sounds of movement when no one is present and the smell of decay with no identifiable source. Whether these accounts reflect genuine disturbance or merely the power of suggestion in a place with such history cannot be determined. What remains certain is that the families of Father Blackwood's victims never received acknowledgement, apology, or justice from the institution that facilitated his crimes and protected him from consequences. The Archdiocese prioritized its reputation over their suffering, and that choice compounded the original violations with decades of enforced silence. Father Cornelius Blackwood was almost certainly not unique, merely the one whose crimes were discovered. Some predators wear vestments, some monsters speak with the voice of God, and some violations continue to cry out from the earth long after the perpetrators have crumbled to dust.